The world didn't notice the moment it changed. Not at first. At 3:17 Universal Time Coordinated, every orbital satellite owned by Earth's major powers went silent at the exact same millisecond. No warning. No degradation. No partial failure that engineers could explain away as coincidence. Just absence. In Houston, an engineer stared at a frozen telemetry screen and laughed nervously. Signal drop. Probably solar interference, he said, even though the sun was calm. In Beijing, a military analyst ran the diagnostics twice, then a third time, slower. The numbers didn't change. The satellites weren't failing. They were no longer answering back. And in Geneva, a civilian astronomer was the first to notice something worse. The night sky had shifted. Not visibly. Not in any way the human eye could immediately register. But star maps no longer matched. Entire reference points were slightly out of position, like someone had nudged reality by a fraction of a degree and refused to admit it. Then came the sound. It started as a pressure wave. A deep, rolling thunder that moved upward, not downward, like the earth itself was exhaling instead of the sky collapsing. Windows didn't shatter. They vibrated, as if something enormous had spoken too close to the surface of existence. Seismographs in 12 countries spiked simultaneously. But there was no earthquake. And then every radar station on Earth lit up at once. Not with incoming missiles. Not with aircraft formations. But with shapes. Masses. Organized structures moving through the upper atmosphere at impossible speeds, slowing without deceleration, turning without inertia, as if the laws of motion were suggestions rather than rules. One operator in NORAD whispered the first thing that came to his mind. That's not weather. The first impact happened in the Pacific Ocean, 1,400 kilometers from any coastline. A column of water rose into the sky like a silent explosion had been inverted. Ships nearby reported a shadow beneath the waves, something vast, coiling, patient. And then it emerged. Not crashing. Not breaching. But rising, as though the ocean had simply decided to release it. It was too large to be immediately understood. Its form defied clean classification. Something between biology and structure, scaled armor that shimmered like heat trapped in glass, wings that didn't flap but unfolded like opening dimensions. It looked at the sky. And the sky reacted. Cloud systems above it spiraled inward, as if acknowledging presence. Within minutes, every communication system on Earth, radio, military, civilian, emergency, hijacked itself. No hacking signature. No breach point. Just overwrite. And then the message came. In every language. Simultaneously. Not spoken. Not transmitted in any physical frequency. It arrived directly in the mind. Clear. Precise. Inescapable. Humanity is not native here. Silence followed. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of response. For exactly 11 seconds, every human who heard it froze in the same shared uncertainty. Then alarms began to scream across continents. Because something in the sky had started moving toward land. Colonel Marcus Hale did not believe in first contact scenarios. Not the cinematic kind, anyway. He had read enough classified briefings, watched enough failed simulations, and survived enough unexpected atmospheric anomalies to know one thing. If something intelligent ever arrived from beyond Earth's understanding, it would not introduce itself politely. Nevada Air Defense Command was already in a controlled panic when he arrived. The kind that didn't involve shouting or chaos, just tight voices, fast typing, and the quiet realization that normal procedures had stopped working. "Sir," a radar technician said, not looking up from his screen, "we've got multiple atmospheric entities over North America, Europe, and the Pacific corridor. They're not following flight physics." Marcus leaned over the console. "What are they following?" The technician hesitated. "Intent." Marcus didn't respond to that. He had been in the military long enough to recognize when a sentence was no longer metaphorical. On the main display, the objects were visible now even without satellite confirmation. Not as clear shapes, but as distortions in the sky, regions where light bent incorrectly, like reality itself was bruised. They moved in coordinated patterns. Not random. Not chaotic. Observed. Then came the Las Vegas descent. At 6:42 local time, every sensor within a 200-kilometer radius detected a single vertical movement. Something enormous had broken through the upper atmosphere without sonic boom, without friction signature, without thermal spike. It simply arrived lower. And lower. Until it hovered above the desert like a decision being made. The city of Las Vegas did what cities always did when confronted with the unknown. It reacted too slowly, then too loudly. Emergency broadcasts activated. Military units scrambled. Tourists filmed the sky, thinking it was some classified test. And Colonel Hale watched it all unfold with the sinking certainty that none of it mattered. The dragon, because by now there was no better word that fit the human mind, did not land in the traditional sense. It stabilized. As if it had chosen a coordinate and made it permanent. Its body was larger than any aircraft known to humanity, but not in a way that obeyed scaling laws. It did not feel like something that occupied space. It felt like something that negotiated with space and was granted temporary permission to exist within it. Its wings did not cast shadows. They interrupted them. Every light source near the landing zone bent toward it, as if curious. Then it spoke. There was no sound. No vibration in air. No signal on any recorded frequency. Every human within a 20-kilometer radius simply understood it. The words formed inside the mind like memories being remembered too late. You built fires in our sky. The desert wind stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Like the planet had paused its own breathing. Marcus felt his grip tighten around the railing. Beside him, a junior officer whispered, "Is it, talking to all of us?" It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. The voice continued. "Now we measure if you deserve them." The meaning was not emotional. Not angry. Not curious. It was procedural. Like a scientist evaluating a specimen that had finally begun to show unexpected behavior. Marcus opened his mouth to issue a command. He never finished it. The first defensive systems activated without authorization. Someone, somewhere, had decided action was better than analysis. Surface-to-air batteries locked. Experimental laser arrays powered up. Satellite-guided rail systems recalibrated on a target that no longer behaved like a target. "Do not engage," Marcus barked into the command channel. "Repeat, do not engage until we understand." Too late. The sky lit up. Not with explosions. With precision. Beams of coherent energy struck the entity in synchronized volleys designed to shred aircraft from existence. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the beams bent. Not reflected. Not absorbed. Redirected. They curved in midair like light had suddenly remembered it could choose direction. And returned. The desert did not explode. It simply erased itself in segments. 3 launch sites went silent before the sound arrived. The dragon did not move. It did not retaliate emotionally. It recalculated. Marcus stared at the empty horizon where infrastructure had existed seconds ago. And then he realized something far worse than destruction. It hadn't been attacked. It had been tested back. The voice returned once more, quieter this time. Almost disappointed. Insufficient response pattern. And then, as if concluding an experiment, the entity lifted from the desert without disturbing a grain of sand. It did not leave. It simply stopped being there. Radar lost it. Sensors failed to track it. But Marcus Hale knew, with absolute certainty, that it had not gone away. It had only moved on to the next observation. And somewhere across the planet, other cities were about to be evaluated. The first thing humanity did after realizing it could not outrun the sky, was stop pretending it could. For years, every major power had built contingency plans around separation, defense zones, evacuation corridors, hardened bunkers, orbital redundancy. All of it assumed one constant truth. If something went wrong, there would still be somewhere else to go. That assumption died over the Pacific when the second wave of aerial entities synchronized their movement patterns across 3 continents without a single shared communication channel that human systems could detect. They weren't spreading. They were surveying at scale. And the implication was immediate: nowhere was a way anymore. Within 48 hours, emergency protocols stopped being national and started becoming structural. Borders became irrelevant overnight. Not because governments agreed, but because reality forced agreement upon them. Colonel Marcus Hale was relocated twice in 6 hours. First to a hardened coordination bunker outside Nevada. Then, without explanation, to a multinational command facility buried beneath what used to be neutral airspace in Central Asia. He stopped asking for reasons. There were none being given anymore. Inside the facility, the world's remaining functioning defense networks had been merged into something no one wanted to name. It wasn't a single command structure. It was an emergency synthesis layer, humanity's attempt to think as one organism before it was forced to become one involuntarily. Screens displayed fragmented atmospheric signatures, drifting patterns of impossible flight paths, and deep space thermal anomalies that refused to resolve into identifiable objects. And then Dr. Evan Mercer arrived. He looked like someone who had not slept in days because he had chosen not to. His credentials were unnecessary, his presence alone had been authorized at levels above clearance systems. He carried no weapons, only data drives and a tablet that was already overloaded with simulations. "I need 30 minutes with full-spectrum telemetry," Mercer said as soon as he stepped into the command chamber. Marcus studied him. "We've been giving full-spectrum telemetry for 2 days." "No," Mercer replied calmly. "You've been giving you interpretations of telemetry. I need the raw signal before your systems decide what it should mean." That sentence made several officers uncomfortable. Marcus didn't argue. He simply ordered access. For the next 27 minutes, Mercer said nothing. He didn't type much either. He watched. He rotated datasets. He remapped correlations across gravitational distortion fields and electromagnetic noise patterns that should not have been stable long enough to analyze. At minute 28, he finally spoke. "They're not using technology." Silence spread through the room in a way that felt heavier than sound. A general asked, "Define not using technology." Mercer didn't look up. "I mean," he said, "they're not applying tools to physics. They're applying grammar." Marcus frowned. "Explain that." Mercer pulled up a projection. The screen displayed atmospheric data, but reorganized. "What you're seeing as flight paths," he said, "are not trajectories. They're syntax structures. Repeated patterns that behave like language rules. The atmosphere responds to them like it's parsing instructions." "That's impossible," someone said immediately. "No," Mercer replied. "It's just incompatible with how we thought physics worked." He zoomed in on a cluster of anomalies over the Indian Ocean. "This isn't propulsion. It's not lift. It's not even motion in the traditional sense. It's localized rule alteration. They're not moving through air. They're redefining what air is allowed to do around them." A technician muttered, "So what, they're rewriting reality?" Mercer finally looked up. "Yes," he said. "But inconsistently. That's the important part." Marcus stepped closer. "Inconsistently how?" Mercer pointed at the display. "Here, here, and here. They avoid full-scale rewriting in stable zones. They only adjust parameters locally, briefly, and then revert. It's controlled. Measured." "Why?" Marcus asked. Mercer hesitated for the first time. "Because," he said slowly, "they're not trying to conquer us." He paused. "They're testing whether we destabilize under observation." That sentence landed harder than any alert siren. A junior analyst whispered, "So Earth is a lab." Mercer didn't deny it. He just added, "And we're not the first sample." The room went quiet again, but it was no longer disbelief. It was recalibration. Marcus turned back to the screens. "Then what's the objective?" Mercer's answer was almost gentle. "To see if we are predictable enough to be classified." As if the universe itself had categories, and humanity was currently unfiled. At that exact moment, every monitor in the facility flickered. Not with a breach. Not with an alarm. But with a synchronized drop in signal latency across all systems simultaneously. And then, across every channel still connected to global airspace sensors, a new pattern emerged. Not attack vectors. Not positioning data. A grid. A mathematical lattice forming over the planet in real time, centered on human population density points. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "They're mapping us," he said quietly. Mercer nodded once. "And now we know," he replied, "we're not the ones moving first anymore." Outside the bunker, the sky changed again. Not visibly. But observably. As if something above Earth had just finished reading the first draft of humanity, and decided it was time to begin the next revision cycle. No one in the bunker said the words "last resort" anymore. That phrase implied there was still a sequence of options. A ladder of escalation. A belief that failure had steps instead of cliffs. By the time Project Black Doctrine was unsealed, humanity had stopped believing in ladders. It was activated at 11:09 Universal Time, coordinated without ceremony. No speeches. No press briefings. No national declarations. Just a single authentication cascade across 3 independent systems that were never meant to agree with each other under normal conditions, and yet, for the first time in recorded history, they did. Deep beneath the Ural Mountains, a facility that officially did not exist began to awaken. Power flowed into chambers older than most current governments. Cooling systems reversed polarity. Shielded cores unlocked states of matter that had never been publicly acknowledged. And Colonel Marcus Hale, now reassigned without title or rank recognition, stood in a circular observation chamber with Dr. Evan Mercer and watched humanity's final insurance policy come online. What exactly is it? Marcus asked. Mercer didn't answer immediately. He was watching a readout that didn't behave like data. It behaved like resistance. Finally, he said, "It's not a weapon system." Marcus gave him a sharp look. "That's not reassuring." "It's not meant to be," Mercer replied. "It's a boundary condition." On the main display, Earth was shown as a layered model: atmospheric, magnetic, gravitational, informational. Over it, faint distortions shimmered like heat haze. The dragon's grid. Still forming. Still refining. Still watching. Black Doctrine did not fire in the traditional sense. There was no ignition sequence. No launch trajectory. Instead, the system began rewriting constraints. Marcus felt the room hum, not physically, but conceptually. Like the idea of temperature was being renegotiated in real time. "What is it doing?" he asked. Mercer's voice tightened. "It's changing what the atmosphere is allowed to agree on." A technician near the far console whispered, "That's not possible. You can't change physical constants locally without collapse." Mercer nodded once. "Correct. Under normal physics." A pause. "This isn't normal physics." On the display, something subtle happened. Over London, one of the dragon entities was descending again. Not attacking, observing. Its motion was smooth, deliberate, almost patient. Then Black Doctrine engaged its first boundary shift. Air density fluctuated by a fraction of a percent. Gravity remained unchanged. Temperature remained stable. But lift efficiency, something no human system had ever needed to isolate, collapsed inside a precisely defined volume of space. For the first time since their arrival, the entity's descent hesitated. Not dramatically. Not violently. But noticeably. Marcus stepped forward. "We hit it." Mercer didn't smile. "We didn't hit it." He tapped the console. "We removed one assumption from its environment." The second boundary shift activated immediately afterward. This time, electromagnetic coherence in the region destabilized, not enough to disrupt human systems, but enough to interfere with the way the entity's presence interacted with local space. The dragon did not fall. But its form flickered. Like a signal losing sync. And that was when Marcus understood. "They are not immune," he said slowly. Mercer nodded. "They're consistent. That's different." Over the next minutes, Black Doctrine expanded its influence and controlled pulses. Not destructive waves, but conceptual corrections. Every adjustment was small enough that human infrastructure remained intact, but precise enough that non-human interaction patterns began to degrade. The dragon's grid above Earth reacted instantly. It tightened. Then expanded. Then recalculated again. For the first time since their arrival, their behavior showed uncertainty. Marcus watched it carefully. "They're adapting." "Yes," Mercer said. "But adaptation requires time." A new alert flashed across the system. Not an intrusion. A response. The dragons were broadcasting again. But this time, it was different. Not a message. A compression. A layered transmission of patterns that didn't resolve into language but into structure, like they were attempting to rewrite the very interface through which humanity was interfering with them. Mercer leaned forward. "They're trying to overwrite the boundary system," he said quietly. Marcus asked, "Can they?" Mercer hesitated. "For the first time," he said, "I don't think they are sure." Outside, above every major city still under observation, the sky began to dim, not from light loss, but from refractive instability. As if reality itself was becoming harder to interpret at altitude. Inside the bunker, alarms did not sound. They had stopped doing that hours ago. Instead, systems displayed probability fields. Stability metrics. Predictive collapse curves. And for the first time since contact began, one of those curves changed direction. Not toward failure. But toward equilibrium. Marcus noticed it immediately. "We're stabilizing it." Mercer shook his head. "No." A pause. "We're becoming harder to classify." On the main display, the dragon's grid shifted again. Slower now. Less confident. As if something that had expected immediate comprehension was now encountering resistance in the form of unpredictability itself. And then came the final shift of Black Doctrine Phase 1. Not an attack. Not a defense. But a declaration embedded in physics itself. Humanity was no longer a passive system to be observed. It was now a variable that altered the observer. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the dragons withdrew their lowest atmospheric layer of presence across multiple regions simultaneously. Not retreat. Reassessment. Marcus exhaled slowly. What just happened? He asked. Mercer looked at the screen where uncertainty had begun to replace certainty. We made them hesitate, he said. A pause. And in their language, that might be the first real answer we've ever given. The sky didn't clear. It reorganized. That was the first thing Dr. Evan Mercer noticed when he stepped into the observation array beneath Black Doctrine's core chamber. The atmospheric maps no longer showed intrusion zones or flight corridors. They showed absence patterns, areas where something had been, then chose not to be. Marcus Hale stood beside him, silent, watching Earth rendered in layers of shifting probability rather than fixed geography. For the first time since contact began, the planet felt less like a battlefield and more like a conversation that neither side fully understood yet. They're pulling back, Marcus said quietly. Mercer didn't answer immediately. He was studying the residual traces left in the system, echoes of the dragon's grid, still flickering like half-erased equations. Not retreating, Mercer finally said. Rebalancing. They don't abandon a model mid-test. They refine it. On the main display, orbital silhouettes, the dragons, or whatever classification humanity had almost accepted, were no longer clustered over population centers. They were spreading outward, forming wider arcs around the planet. Observing from distance. Measuring differently. As if proximity had become less useful than perspective. Then the first fragmented transmission arrived. Not through channels. Not through systems. Through the same impossible mechanism as before, direct cognition, shared across anyone connected to Black Doctrine infrastructure. But this time, it wasn't absolute. It was broken. Distorted. Like something struggling to maintain coherence. You are not native, but you are adapting faster than expected. The sentence repeated in fragments across multiple minds, overlapping and misaligned, as if the sender itself was uncertain how to format thought anymore. Marcus clenched his jaw. They're confused. Mercer nodded slowly. No. They're recalibrating what confused means. A technician nearby spoke without looking up from his console. Their grid structure is degrading. Not collapsing, just losing precision. Marcus turned. Explain. They're not tracking us cleanly anymore, the technician said. Our systems are introducing noise into their model. Intentional or not, we're not behaving consistently enough for stable prediction. Mercer's eyes narrowed. We've become stochastic. Marcus gave him a look. We've become what? Unpredictable by design or by accident, Mercer said. It doesn't matter. The effect is the same. On the display, one of the orbital entities shifted position, then corrected, then shifted again. Each movement slightly less certain than the last. Marcus studied it for a long moment. They came here expecting physics to be a closed system, he said. We're showing them it's not. Mercer didn't disagree. Instead, he pulled up a layered reconstruction of Black Doctrine's influence fields over time. Look at this. Marcus leaned in. At first, it looked like controlled interference zones, carefully bounded regions where atmospheric and electromagnetic rules had been altered. But over time, something subtle emerged. The boundaries weren't just affecting the dragons. They were affecting observation itself. What am I looking at? Marcus asked. Mercer's voice lowered. Feedback. A pause. Every time they adjust their model of us, we adjust the conditions they're using to build that model. Marcus frowned. So they can't stabilize their understanding. Exactly. The room fell quiet. Outside the reinforced structure, Earth continued rotating under a sky that no longer behaved like a fixed dome but like an interface under constant revision. Then came the second transmission. Shorter. Less structured. More human. We did not account for resistance at the level of definition. Mercer froze. Marcus noticed. What is it? That's not evaluation language anymore, Mercer said quietly. That's acknowledgement of uncertainty. A third signal attempted to form, but fragmented halfway through. Reclassify, or terminate experiment. It broke apart before completion. Marcus exhaled slowly. They're losing control of the narrative. Mercer nodded. or discovering they never had full control to begin with. On the outer orbital layer, the dragons began to drift farther apart. Not fleeing, not advancing, spreading. As if distance itself was becoming a tool for reanalysis. Marcus stared at the screen. Are we winning? Mercer didn't answer immediately. Then, carefully. We're becoming harder to define than they are certain how to measure. A pause. That might be the only form of victory that matters here. At that moment, Black Doctrine's core systems registered a global shift. Not an attack. Not a retreat. A cessation of probing activity. The grid that had once encircled Earth like an invisible lattice loosened, then partially dissolved. Marcus stepped closer to the console. They stopped. Mercer shook his head. No. They paused input. Why? Mercer looked at him. Because for the first time since arrival, he said, their model no longer converges. A long silence followed. In it, the realization settled across everyone in the chamber. The dragons had not been defeated. They had encountered something their framework could not finalize. Not resistance. Not defense. But inconsistency that refused resolution. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low. So what happens now? Mercer watched the fading traces of the grid above Earth, still flickering like an unfinished equation. Now, he said, they decide whether humanity is a mistake. A pause. Or the first proof that their assumptions were never complete. Outside, the sky held its distance. And for the first time since the day it broke open, it did not declare an answer.